My father thought picking up two strangers on a lonely highway was just another late-night fare. But the suitcase they left behind carried more than a body, it carried a curse. What followed was a haunting that tore through our family and nearly drove him to madness. My name is Daniel, and the story I am about to share is one that has haunted my family for over a decade. It is a story about my father, Michael, who worked as an Uber driver in Houston, Texas. Back when I was still in high school, I never knew the terrible truth of what he went through. My parents kept it from me and my younger sister for years, thinking we were too young to handle it. I only learned the whole story later, when I was in college, and by then, the scars had already shaped our lives in ways I could never have imagined. This isn't just about a crime, though there was one. This isn't just about tragedy, though tragedy is at its heart. This is about something darker, something that clawed its way into my father's life after a single night's encounter and never quite let him go. I tell it now with his permission, though it has taken him years to accept that his nightmare might be shared. It was about 10 years ago. My father had been driving for Uber for a while, working late shifts because they paid better. The Houston airport was always good for business, travelers arriving late, tired, desperate for a ride home or to a hotel. That night, my father had just dropped off a passenger at the airport and was heading back toward the city. It was close to 11 p.m., and he was exhausted. He wanted nothing more than to get home to my mom, who was waiting up for him, and grab a few hours of sleep before waking early to help her run their small breakfast shop. The stretch of road from the airport to the city was long, straight, and dark. On either side were fields and patches of woods. Not the kind of place you expected to see pedestrians. Yet, as my father drove, he noticed two figures on the shoulder of the road waving their arms. They were young men, maybe in their 20s. One carried a large, heavy-looking suitcase, and the other had only a backpack. He told me later that his gut told him not to stop. Every instinct said to keep driving. But he was a kind man, and he felt guilty about leaving them stranded so late at night on a desolate road. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. The men approached quickly. One asked if he could open the trunk so they could put the suitcase inside. My father popped the trunk latch, and he started to get out, as he always did, to help load luggage. But one of the men raised a hand. "Don't worry about it," the young man said. "We got it." Something about the way he insisted unsettled my father. But he didn't argue. He stayed inside the car, watching them through the rearview mirror as they hefted the heavy suitcase into the trunk. Then they climbed into the back seat and asked him to take them to the airport. It didn't make much sense. He had just come from there. But they explained in a rushed, nervous tone that they had gotten into a fight with a friend who had abandoned them on the road, and now they were desperate not to miss their flight. The ride was short, maybe 10 minutes. The men barely spoke. My father pulled up at the departures area, put the car in park, and released the trunk so they could retrieve their luggage. He didn't get out this time either. He just watched as they pulled the suitcase from the trunk, set it down, and closed the lid. Then, strangely, they didn't take the suitcase with them. They just waved goodbye, smiled thinly, and disappeared into the terminal. My father blinked in confusion. He waited for them to realize their mistake, to come back for the suitcase. But they never did. After a few minutes, with no one returning, he assumed maybe they had made some arrangement with a friend inside or had left it by accident. Exhausted, he drove home. My father pulled into the driveway just before midnight, weary from a long night on the road. The house was dark and quiet, the street empty, the hum of his car the only sound breaking the silence. Too exhausted to do anything else, he slipped out of his shoes, walked softly through the narrow hallway, and slid into bed beside my mother. She stirred briefly, asked if he was all right, but he only muttered a tired yes before sleep claimed him. At that moment, nothing existed in his mind but the comfort of rest. The events of the night, the strange passengers, the heavy suitcase, they were buried under a fog of fatigue. Before the first light of dawn, my parents woke together, as they always did, to prepare for another day of work. Their small breakfast stand was the heartbeat of our mornings, a modest shop attached to the side of our home. They sold breakfast tacos wrapped in warm tortillas, steaming cups of coffee, and sandwiches that locals grabbed on their way to work. It was a rhythm they had perfected: rise at 5, cook in the kitchen, stock supplies, and open by 7. That morning seemed no different at first. Yet, as they stepped into the driveway carrying crates of ingredients, something immediately felt wrong. A smell, thick, sour, almost tangible, hung in the air. It was not faint or passing, it clung to their clothes, wormed into their nostrils, made them stop mid-step. My mother wrinkled her nose and frowned. She guessed it might be a raccoon, or maybe a stray dog, that had crawled into a ditch nearby and died. Such things weren't unheard of in Houston's outskirts. But this smell was heavier, more suffocating, and it grew stronger the closer they came to my father's car. Following the stench, my father realized with a chill that it was coming directly from the trunk of his Uber vehicle. His heart sank. Hands trembling, he fished out his keys, the metal jingling far louder than usual in the quiet morning. He inserted one into the lock, twisted, and slowly lifted the trunk lid. The wave of odor that escaped was unbearable, so powerful it felt like a physical force pushing them back. My father gagged, covering his mouth with the crook of his arm, while my mother stumbled several steps away, her hand pressed firmly against her face. The source of the smell was undeniable. Sitting squarely in the trunk was the same black suitcase the two young men had loaded the night before. For a long, awful moment, neither of them moved. The suitcase seemed to radiate menace, as though it contained something more than just weight. It contained dread, secrecy, and the echo of whatever horror had been placed inside. My mother's voice broke the silence. She pleaded with my father not to open it. Her intuition, sharpened by years of hardship and survival, told her that what lay inside was far worse than either of them could bear. "Leave it," she begged. "Call someone. Don't touch it." But my father, stubborn and practical, shook his head. He needed to know. Ignorance was worse. He could not leave the mystery sealed when the evidence of something vile was already so clear. Taking a rag from the kitchen supplies, he tied it around his face to mask the smell, then pulled on the thick rubber gloves my mother used when scrubbing pots. With a deep, shaky breath, he stepped forward and knelt by the suitcase. The zipper rasped open, loud and deliberate, like the tearing of fabric in a church. He pulled it slowly, his hands trembling harder with every inch. When the bag finally yawned open, what lay inside made him recoil instantly. There, twisted and lifeless, was the body of a young woman. Her limbs were bent at unnatural angles, her skin pale and gray, already beginning to decompose. Her eyes, half-lidded, stared upward without seeing, clouded and dull. She looked as though she had once been vibrant, but now she was only a shell. My father staggered backward, a strangled scream ripping from his throat. The rag slipped from his face as he doubled over, tears streaming from his eyes, the stench unbearable. "Oh God," he cried. "It's a woman. A dead woman." His voice was hoarse, raw with shock and horror. My mother, who had refused to look, turned away completely now, covering her ears. She did not need to see. The terror in my father's voice was enough to tell her everything. Without hesitation, she bolted back into the house, her hand shaking so violently she nearly dropped the phone as she dialed the police. In those few moments, the ordinary routine of our morning was shattered. The breakfast stand, the smell of coffee, the comfort of family life, all of it was replaced by dread. The driveway, once a place of everyday bustle, was now a crime scene, a stage for a nightmare that neither of my parents had invited but were forced to witness. And though the authorities would arrive, though the body would be identified, though suspects would eventually be found and justice pursued, nothing could erase the memory of that discovery. Nothing could undo the sound of the zipper sliding open, the sight of lifeless eyes staring into the morning sky, or the realization that evil had been carried unknowingly in the trunk of my father's car. You might think the story ended that morning. You might believe the nightmare concluded once the body was found, once the police took control, once the arrests were made. But you would be wrong. For my father, that moment in the driveway was not the end. It was only the beginning. After the body was taken away, after the police had finished their questions, after the neighbors, who had spent hours whispering and staring from across the street, finally retreated into their homes, my father tried to return to normal. He had no choice. Life does not pause for nightmares. Bills still arrived in the mail. Food still needed to be put on the table. The mortgage still had to be paid. So, with the same weary determination that had carried him through countless hard years, my father slid behind the wheel of his Uber car once again. At first, he told himself it would be fine. The worst was over. The authorities had handled the situation. The criminals would be caught. The car, though stained in memory, was just a car, metal, rubber, and glass. He thought if he worked hard enough, if he ignored the shiver crawling along his spine whenever he glanced at the trunk, the weight of the past would eventually lift. But from the very next night, the strange occurrences began. It started with the sound. Driving late-night passengers had always been my father's routine. He was used to the hum of the engine, the creak of old shocks, the faint rattle of loose tools in the glove compartment. So when he first heard it, a faint knocking, soft but deliberate, coming from the trunk, he dismissed it. Old cars make noises, he told himself. Metal shifts, bolts loosen, things rattle. That was all. Yet the sound persisted. Knock. 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 It came at odd intervals, never steady, never rhythmic, as though someone were testing the walls of the trunk, probing for weakness. The first time a passenger mentioned it, my father's stomach twisted. A young man sitting in the back leaned forward, his voice tight with unease. "Hey, man, do you have something back there?" he asked. "Sounds like." "I don't know, like someone's trying to get out." My father forced a laugh, brushing it off. He said it was probably just the suspension, or maybe something rolling around in the trunk. His words were light, casual, but his heart was hammering. Because he knew. He knew exactly what had once occupied that space. He could still see the suitcase, black and heavy, sitting there like a silent predator. He could still smell the stench that had seeped into the fabric of the car, a stench that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. The knocking grew worse. It was louder now, sharper, no longer easy to dismiss as a trick of imagination. Sometimes, when he parked the car and switched off the engine, the sound would continue, echoing in the silence of the night. The knock seemed to throb in the stillness, as though the trunk itself carried a pulse. And then came the night he heard more than just knocking. He was alone, the city quiet around him, the hour late enough that the streets were empty. The air felt heavy, pressing in on the windshield. That was when it happened. From the trunk, faint at first, came the sound of crying. It was muffled, smothered by the metal barrier, but unmistakably human. A woman's sobs, low, broken, and filled with despair. My father's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at him to stop the car, to pull over, to open the trunk and prove to himself that it was empty. But he couldn't. Fear held him captive, glued to his seat, forcing him to keep driving as though nothing was wrong. The crying faded after a few moments, dissolving back into silence, but the damage was done. My father's mind had crossed a line it could never return from. He no longer believed it was just the car. No longer believed it was only his imagination. Because deep down, he was certain something from that suitcase had stayed behind. The sounds alone would have been enough to unsettle anyone. For most men, hearing knocks from an empty trunk or muffled sobs with no visible source would have been the limit, a story to whisper in hushed tones and then forget. But for my father, it did not stop there. The noises were only the beginning. What came next was far more disturbing, far more personal, and it shook him to his core. One evening, my father picked up a woman and her young daughter. They were ordinary passengers, heading home after visiting relatives, their arms filled with shopping bags. The child climbed into the back seat, cheerful, humming to herself, while her mother offered polite small talk. For the first half of the ride, everything was normal. But then, halfway down a long stretch of road, the little girl suddenly stopped humming. She turned her head, tilted it slightly, and began whispering into the empty air beside her. At first, my father thought she was playing some kind of game, the way children often do when they invent imaginary friends. But then her mother asked gently, "Sweetheart, who are you talking to?" The girl giggled. "The lady," she replied matter-of-factly. "The lady sitting next to me. She says she's cold." My father's grip tightened on the wheel until his knuckles whitened. His pulse thundered in his ears. He dared not look in the rearview mirror, terrified of what he might see reflected there. The mother, confused, tried to hush her daughter, insisting no one was there. But the girl insisted, pointing at the empty seat. "She's right here, Mommy. She's right here." When my father dropped them off, he forced a smile, but as soon as the door closed and the passengers were gone, he sat frozen for several long minutes, unable to move. The seat where the girl had pointed felt heavier somehow, as if it truly was occupied. That was only the first of many encounters. Over the following weeks, the visions grew worse. My father began to glimpse fleeting shapes in the corner of his eye, long strands of dark hair drifting across the back seat, a pale hand pressed against the glass of the window. Sometimes, in the rearview mirror, he caught sight of a face. It was never clear, never solid, but always there, a woman's features, blurred and distorted, hovering just behind his shoulder. Every time he blinked, she vanished, leaving only the empty seat staring back. Sleep offered no relief. At night, my father would wake drenched in sweat, convinced someone was standing at the foot of his bed. He would leap up, heart pounding, only to find the room empty. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered long after. Even passengers noticed. A group of college students once asked to be let out early after one of them swore she saw someone sitting in the back seat with them, a silent figure who never moved. Another man complained that the air in the car suddenly turned icy cold, as though a window had been left open. But all the windows were closed. My father's anxiety grew unbearable. He began dreading each ride, bracing himself for what new terror might reveal itself. Driving, once a source of income and routine, became an ordeal filled with paranoia. Every shadow became a threat, every reflection a potential glimpse of the dead. The worst part was the growing certainty inside him. It was not imagination. It was not fatigue. The woman whose body had once been sealed inside that black suitcase had not left. Her presence clung to the car, bound to it as surely as rust bound to the metal. And with every passing night, my father felt her closing in. The haunting did not fade with time. Instead, it grew bolder, more aggressive, as though the presence inside the car was testing its limits, pushing further into my father's life with each passing night. The sounds had been terrifying, and the shadows unbearable, but what came next nearly broke him. It began with the scream. One night, after dropping off his last passenger, my father drove down a nearly deserted stretch of highway. The city lights were far behind him, and the road stretched endlessly forward, lit only by the weak beams of his headlights. He was tired but relieved that his shift was almost over. Then, from the trunk, it came a shriek so piercing, so full of agony, that it froze his blood. It was a woman's scream. Sharp, desperate, filled with terror, it echoed inside the car as though the trunk had become a coffin of sound. My father panicked, swerved violently, and nearly crashed into the guardrail. He pulled over, breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he scrambled out of the driver's seat. With shaking fingers, he fumbled with the key, popped the trunk, and flung it open. Nothing. The trunk was empty, just as it had been every other time. Yet the air around him carried the unmistakable stench, the foul, suffocating odor of rot, that he had first smelled on the morning he discovered the suitcase. It clung to his skin, seeped into his clothes, and filled his lungs until he gagged. Gasping, he slammed the trunk shut and stumbled back into the driver's seat. His nerves were shattered. He drove home in silence, his body trembling uncontrollably. That was the night he told my mother he couldn't keep working with that car anymore. But even when the car sat unused in the driveway, the haunting did not stop. My sister, who was 8 at the time, began waking in the middle of the night. She claimed she saw a woman standing outside her bedroom window, staring in. Her window overlooked the driveway, where the Uber car was parked. Every night, she said, the same figure returned, long hair hanging down, pale face pressed against the glass, eyes fixed on her. My parents tried to comfort her, telling her it was just bad dreams, but her terror was too real. She refused to sleep alone. I didn't believe her. I was 14, old enough to dismiss ghost stories as childish nonsense. But one night, I woke to use the bathroom. Passing her room, I noticed her curtain swaying, though the window was closed. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something pale. For an instant, it looked like a face staring in. When I blinked, it was gone. From that moment, I stopped doubting. Things grew worse. My father began hearing voices, whispers so close they seemed to come from the back seat. Sometimes, it was breathing, slow, deliberate, as if someone were sitting right behind him. Other times, he felt pressure against his chair, as though unseen hands were pushing forward. Passengers noticed, too. More than once, someone asked to be let out early. They said the car felt wrong, or that they sensed someone else was inside with them. My father would force a laugh, but inside he was unraveling. The haunting escalated beyond the car. At home, objects moved on their own, cups sliding across tables, doors creaking open at night. My mother tried to explain it away, but my father knew. The spirit was no longer confined to the car. It had followed him, seeped into our home, and wrapped its icy grip around our entire family. By then, my father was terrified not only for himself but for us. He knew the presence wanted to be acknowledged, wanted to be felt. And the more he denied it, the stronger it became. The haunting reached a climax that my father could no longer endure. For weeks, he had tried to push forward, convincing himself that if he ignored the signs, the terror would fade. But denial only seemed to feed the presence. It grew stronger, louder, more relentless, until finally, he broke. One night, while driving home after midnight, he felt it again, the weight against the back of his seat, the sensation of someone breathing directly into his ear. The air inside the car grew icy, his breath fogging the windshield. Then came the whisper, soft and unmistakable, the woman's voice saying, "Help me." My father nearly lost control of the vehicle. He slammed the brakes, heart racing, and stumbled out into the cold night air. Standing on the shoulder of the road, staring at the empty car, he knew he couldn't keep living like this. The terror wasn't just his anymore. It was seeping into our home, into our lives, poisoning the very air we breathed. That night, he told my mother he would never drive that car again. It didn't matter that bills were piling up, or that work was scarce. Nothing mattered except getting rid of it. He said the vehicle carried more than memories. It carried her, the spirit of the girl whose body had once been trapped inside. Within days, my father sold the car for scrap, refusing to even negotiate the price. He just wanted it gone. Watching it towed away brought a wave of relief, though the fear never fully left his eyes. For him, that decision was the breaking point, the moment he chose survival over denial, the moment he finally admitted that what haunted him was real. Years later, when I was in college, my father finally told me everything. We sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling around a cup of coffee, as he recounted the night he picked up the two men, the suitcase, the discovery, the haunting that followed. As I listened, I realized how close we had come to being destroyed by something none of us had asked for. A chance encounter, a moment of misplaced kindness, had brought a nightmare into our home. Even now, my father avoids talking about it. He still drives, but never at night, never near the airport. And though he tries to hide it, I can see the fear in his eyes whenever he passes a black suitcase on the sidewalk, or when a knock echoes from somewhere he can't quite explain. My sister, now grown, admits she still sometimes dreams of the woman outside her window. As for me, I carry the story like a weight. Not because it happened to me, but because it happened to my father, and it changed him forever. It showed me how thin the line is between the ordinary and the unthinkable, how one decision to stop for two strangers on a dark road can alter a life. Some nightmares don't end when you wake up. Some stay with you, whispering in the dark, reminding you that what's dead doesn't always rest. And when I think back on that house in Houston, on those sleepless nights filled with knocks and shadows, I know one thing with certainty: the dead girl's spirit was not finished with my father. She only left because the car left. But I sometimes wonder, if the car still exists, rusting in some scrapyard under the Texas sun, does she linger there still, waiting, trapped inside the memory of that suitcase, searching for someone new to hear her cry?